remember that usually wait a few minutes. The usual 10 minutes.
You guys can move to the front. You don't need to sit in the back. I don't bite. It's great. Due cose. Di Elisa Segnini, Censorship at the University of Glasgow. Quella lì è anche troppo lunga. Perché lo considerano di TV.
Fa senso.
Vabbè. Ma fai una cosa breve. Fai una cosa breve. Se ve lo dicevi te portavo una copia.
No, perché sono maschere. Cioè,
Sì, qualche riferimento c'è. C'è un capitolo su D'Annunzio. Un capitolo su D'Annunzio. Ci sta sempre. L'avevo tolto nel libro, non mi ricordo perché l'avevo tolto dal libro. Non mi ricordo, nella tesi c'era, originariamente. Se vuoi la cerco la bio, ma che non riesco a entrare nelle mie. La posso cercare la biografia che ho dato a Adriano, ma non so se. Sì, basta, fai una cosa breve.
Sì.
Bello il poster, Adriano l'ha fatto bene.
No, perché
Gli occhiali adesso vanno di nuovo di moda. Guarda bene. La forma.
Very good. Well, thank you then. Welcome to our yesterday's Gojo lecture, as it were. I always welcome those who are here in person and those who join us on our YouTube channel. But I really, a special welcome to those who, were able to make it in spite of the weather and of the fact that the lecture was postponed from yesterday when the entire university was shut down. Elisa was able to, was here, already planned to be here today, so that we were able to postpone the event. And I'm particularly because I was quite excited about having Elisa here, not just for the topic of her talk, which in many ways I think is very much in the spirit of Is Plus. It's about an Italian writer who wrote mostly in Italian, but also in French and Spanish, and was the granddaughter, as I'm sure Elisa will tell us, not too many spoilers, but she was also the granddaughter of the first president. So we have Italian, Spanish, Latin American studies. If you can see in Portuguese, we got the whole range of Is Plus. But I'm also very glad to have Elisa here to share with us, because Elisa is in fact a product of this august university. Elisa was a PhD in comparative literature here at the University of Toronto, but right now she's at the University of Glasgow in the Department of Modern Languages. She is a specialist, as I said, she's a comparatist in terms of her background, and a specialist in modern European literatures between the 19th and the 20th centuries. She has published extensively. I will just mention her two books, her book, Fragments, Genius and Madness, Masks and Mask Making in the Fin de Siècle Imagination, which came out in 2021, and an edited volume on Gabriele D'Annunzio, World Literature, Multilingualism, Translation, Reception, which came out in 2023. Elisa's work often moves among languages. She's interested, among other things. As I said, this is very much or her research is something that is very much in the spirit of their new department, and I'm glad to be able to welcome her here in person, not online. With no further ado, what makes a controversial comparison? Alba de Céspedes, the 1968 insurrections and the Cuban Revolution. Elisa Sanghini, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luca, and I would really like to thank the department for inviting me. I taught here, so it's very exciting to be back and be able to share my research now. It's also lovely to be in Toronto in January, because you would not believe in me, but I do miss Toronto in January. So I was very happy to see the snow despite the inconvenience. But you know, in Glasgow we have pretty much the same temperature all year round, so it's very exciting to have a little bit of real winter. So I did my PhD here with a foot in Italian studies and a foot in comparative, as you will probably be able to tell from my talk. And I'm going to be talking about comparisons today, and more specifically about what makes a controversial comparison, and also what is the role of comparisons in the historical narratives. So I'm going to use the work of Alba de Céspedes as an entry point to discuss these questions. So how many of you have heard of Alba de Céspedes? It's okay to say no? Oh, yeah, great, quite a few. So she was very famous during her lifetime, and then disappeared for a few years, but then she's one of the writers who kind of rode the Elena Ferrante wave, right? So one publisher noticed at some point that Elena Ferrante had spoken about Alba de Céspedes in La Frantumaglia, and that she mentioned her as an inspiration, and so he went right to Mondadori and said, really, it's time to reissue Alba de Céspedes, time to issue retranslations in German, translations in followed suit, in German, translations in followed suit, and retranslations into English. So today you can not only, again, buy the Mondadori editions of Alba de Céspedes, which wasn't possible until a few years ago. Mondadori had actually to reacquire the right. And then you can also find the new translations, so you can read the new English and French and German retranslations. So I will be drawing on research at the Mondadori Foundation in Milan. Alba de Céspedes, as you'll gather from my talk, had a quite large ego and spent the last decades of her life gathering documents for it. Now, one thing that I would like to say is that when we deal with this kind of archive, we have to be aware that there is always a selection process, right? So there are things that are located in the archive, but there are also documents that are not in the archive, and that she carefully took out of the archive. So in my research, I was really interested in what was not there. That was kind of my point of departure. So what is not in the archive? What has she deliberately erased from the archive? And especially in issues of censorship. So I'll be drawing on my research in this archive, and I'll be talking mainly about two case studies. So the first is an article that de Céspedes in 1959, in the occasion of the Cuban Revolution, on the weekly column that she held on the magazine Epoca, also issued by Mondadori. And the second is a collection of poems in French on the occasion of the 1968 insurrections in Paris. So I'll be talking not only about I'll be talking about the comparisons that works, but I'll also be talking about how these comparisons affect the afterlife in translations of these works, and how issues of censorship are at play. So let's see, I'm in the right direction. Very good. So in examining this text, I will be distinguishing between vertical comparisons, that is, comparisons that establish a relation between events positioned at different historical times, and what I call horizontal comparisons, that is, comparisons that establish a connection between geographically distant events. So while horizontal comparisons are necessarily transnational, vertical comparisons can be either based in the nation state or can go beyond. So as I will explain, in Alba de Céspedes' works, the horizontal comparisons drive the desire for translation, but they are comparisons that prevent translation from taking place. Okay, so I'm going to introduce briefly Alba de Céspedes for those of you who don't know her yet. She was born in 1911 into a special family. Her mother was Laura Bertini, so again from a very wealthy, well-established family. And her father, we can see him here on the right, was Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, and at the time of her birth was Cuban ambassador in Cuba. Her grandfather, which is in the painting on the left, her grandfather, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes del Castillo, was a hero, right? And he is known in Cuba as father of the nation for having started the independence wars. So she came from a very international cosmopolitan family and a very influential family as well. When Alba de Céspedes was 3 years old, her father appointed ambassador in Washington, and her parents decided that it was better to leave her behind than become an American, or at least that's how they tell the story. So they basically abandoned her in the care of her maternal and paternal aunts, and she grew up between Rome and the suburbs of Paris. Noted that she was, of course, familiar with French. She was homeschooled. She really wanted, she talks about how she wanted to go to school like everybody else, but because she was moving constantly, she was homeschooled. She married at 15-year-old, so in theory to obtain Italian citizenship. She had a child at 6 years old. Then shortly afterwards, she separated from her husband, moved back to Rome, and started making a living as a writer. She wrote for Il Mattino and so on. So her first novel was published in 1936, and it's called Io, suo padre. You probably haven't heard of this novel. She tried to erase it as could subsequently. So it's a novel that was written to represent Italy at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. So we're in 1936. And the novel is not only in line, but even exalts fascist values. It hasn't been written. Read it at the Mondadori Foundation in the archive. So we can already see the contradiction in Alba de Céspedes' character, because 1936 is also the time in which she is detained for 6 days at the famous female prison Le Mantellate, the prison in Rome. She was lucky to have a father who was a diplomat, so she got out 6 days later. She didn't stay a very long time, but she makes a big deal about this in subsequent writing. Why was she detained? She gives very different explanations about the reason. Sometimes she says that she was hiding anti-fascist friends in her flat, but we have no evidence of this. Other times she says that she was taking part in a demonstration against the invasion of Abyssinia, what is today Ethiopia. But it seems more likely that there's a telephone tapping in which, among other things, she was also saying that Italians would be fools to invade Ethiopia. What is that she was under the surveillance of the fascist regime because she wasn't a very good example of what a woman should be under fascism, right? She was a young mother, separated from her, very determined to make a living out of her writing, and this wasn't a very good pulse. It wasn't what the fascist regime was looking for. And so this comes back in Nessuno torna indietro, the first novel published with Mondadori in 1938. So the meeting with Alberto Mondadori is very important, and she would be very close. She was very close to Alberto Mondadori. There is this anecdote that she tells that Mondadori met with her and told her, "But who am I? You know who I am. I'm a very important person. Your career is going to change." And this actually happened, because Nessuno torna indietro became a huge bestseller. It was published in countries, 18 languages, circulated widely. It was an autobiographical novel, and it also has a single mother as a protagonist. So after separating from her husband, she had a relationship with an Italian diplomat, Franco Benoit, and the two of them were in Rome in 1943, and when Rome was invaded by the Germans, they had to leave because especially her partner as a diplomat was in a very difficult position. So they crossed the line that separated fascist Italy from the territories of the Allies, and they hid in Abruzzo. And from Abruzzo, Alba de Céspedes, under the name of Clorinda, directed the radio Italia Combatte, in which she invited women to take part in the fight against fascism. Then she went back to Rome in 1944 and she directed the journal Mercurio, which became very important for quite distinguished anti-fascist intellectuals, among whom Natalia Ginzburg, Alberto Moravia, Sibilla Reramo, Aldo Palazzeschi, they all published Mercurio. So quite an influential journal. She was also very active in the organizations for the fight against illiteracy in the post-war context. So she was a very cosmopolitan. So she, in her own English, Austrian, German, and a little bit of Russian. And this meant that she was very, very attentive to the translations of her books. She followed the translation of her books very closely, and she corresponded with her translators, and she was willing to make her books depending on the target readership. So she was always very, very aware that translation is a sort of remediation. So the novel Nessuno torna indietro was followed by other successes. So you might have heard of Dalla parte di lei or Quaderno Proibito, which have been recently reissued. She was very, very prolific, so very prolific writer. But around the end of the 1950s, her fame began to wane. She was very dissatisfied with how Mondadori was marketing her books. She felt that they weren't paying a lot of attention to her work, and she was furious because apparently people were thinking of her as a scrittrice, so as somebody who was writing novels for women, and she wrote that. So in her diary she wrote, "Si dimentica, mi si confina tra le scrittrici femminili." You know, nowadays she's marketed as a feminist, not consider herself a feminist, and most of all, she really did not want to as a woman writer. She wanted to be seen as a political, engaged writer. So in 1967, she got fed up and she moved to Paris. So this is her house in Paris. And there, at the age of 6, she started writing in French. She had never done this seriously before. She started writing what became a huge novel, Son o la nuit, so nel buio, self-translated into Italian as Nel buio della notte. So Alba de Céspedes hated self-translation. She talks about it as an excruciating experience, but she still did it. So this is also the time in which she reconnects to Cuba. So connections to Cuba had been very limited, despite her parents ending their life there. She went to Cuba for the first time in 1940. Her father was very ill, and then she returned in the 1950s to make arrangement for her mother. She had a half-brother in Cuba, a son of her father with another wife. And it's quite interesting because half-brother took care of all her family's properties, which was also why she was sent from Cuba. But in the archive, and her archive is massive, right? There are several rules taken by her documents. There is absolutely no mention of this house, completely erased from the archive. And we'll understand why. She really wanted to be seen as the only heir of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. So her last visit to pre-revolutionary Cuba took place in 1956. And this is also the year in which Fidel Castro and Ernesto Guevara gather guerrilla fighters and start a war against the regime of Batista. So that she followed the revolution from a distance. So in an article written in Epoca on January 18, she wrote, l'anno nuovo incomincia bene. Fidel Castro ha costretto Batista a lasciare il governo di Cuba e a fuggire all'estero. Is it all right if I read in the citations? Yeah, is that okay? Okay. So we know from this article that from the very beginning she's backing up Fidel Castro, right? From the very beginning she believes in the revolution. She has no hesitation about this. And the rest of the article consists in a series of intertwined comparisons, which kind of function like domino pieces, right? They have one term in common with the next comparison. In this comparison, she compares powerful Italian and Cuban leaders. So the first is what I call a vertical comparison, in the sense that it takes place across time. And in this comparison, she compares her grandfather, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes y de Quesada, who was briefly Cuban president in 1933, and the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, who ruled Cuba from 1940 to 1944, and then from 1952 to 1959. And she claims that the difference between the two leaders stands out especially at the moment in which they were forced to leave power. Her father left gracefully and with dignity, whereas cowardly abandoned the country to save his own life. This is followed by a horizontal comparison in which she compares Fulgencio Batista and Benito Mussolini. Funny, because she starts from the fact that the two have a family name which reminds of a piece of cloth, right? Mussola and Batista. And so she's like, oh, from there you can already see the similarity too. But Batista comes across as the lesser evil. So she writes, pur detestando Batista, dovevo riconoscere che egli non aveva emanato nel proprio paese una legge contro gli ebrei, né avrebbe mai usato di guerra a una potenza come gli Stati Uniti e il mondo intero. The next comparison still has Batista as a comparandum, but this time Batista is compared to Fidel Castro. So she almost takes the stance of a physiognomist and she compares the photographs of the two leaders as they are published by European newspapers. So she writes, dietro lo sguardo furbesco, l'aspetto solido, tutto materiale di Batista, vi sono quegli affaristi pronti all'accroglio, numerosi anche nel nostro paese, e dietro l'aspetto grave, romantico di Fidel Castro vi sono los abogados, los letrados, los licenciados. So lawyers, men of letters, people with degrees, and so on. Comparison is a vertical comparison that establishes a relation between Del Castro and her grandfather, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes and del Castillo. And it is a comparison that involves elements of upbringing and ideology. So she writes, mio nonno, nell'abolire la schiavitù, disse ai propri schiavi, e per provarvi che siamo tutti liberali, tutti voi siete liberi. Anche lui era avvocato, figlio di ricchi, studioso di filosofia. Anche lui, come Fidel Castro, bruciò la sua casa, che conteneva un'importante biblioteca, bruciò le sue piantagioni e con la campana che serviva per chiamare al lavoro gli operai, chiamò i cubani delle province di Oriente alla rivoluzione. Anche lui, come in un recente passato Fidel Castro, era rimasto con pochi uomini. So this comparison is something that she builds on for her entire production. So we find comparisons all over the place between her grandfather and Castro in the archive. Sometimes she goes to very absurd details, where both like to swim, both like to eat fish, and stuff like that. So very, very little details. So she really wants to see a very personal also in the two leaders. So the vertical comparison that established a relationship between the Céspedes and Castro was in line with Fidel Castro's rhetoric. In fact, Fidel Castro argued that as the Céspedes and José Martín with the independence wars had put an end to Spanish domination in Cuba, so in the same way the Cuban revolutionaries had put an end to US imperialism in Cuba. So it is almost, Castro's rhetoric, it is almost as if the independence wars in the 19th century prefigured the advent of the revolution in 1959. So the Céspedes writing was very much in line with that. However, the horizontal comparisons that established a relation between pre-revolutionary Cuba and fascist Italy were her own making. And they were born out of her desire to establish a relation between the Cuban Revolution and the ethics and ideal of the Italian resistance movement, of which the Communist Party in the Italian contest claimed to be the heir. So in the archive we find over and over a speech by Fidel Castro transcribed by the Céspedes. So it's a speech held on October 10th, 1968 on the anniversary of the beginning of the independence wars in Cuba. And so the Céspedes transcribes excerpts all over the place. She translates it into Italian, she translates it into French, she also transcribes it in Spanish. I know that she was planning to use it as an epigraph for a novel about Cuba that she starts thinking about in these years. So the speech goes like this. Che significa per il nostro popolo il 10 ottobre 1862? Che significa per i rivoluzionari della nostra patria quella data gloriosa? Significa semplicemente l'inizio di 100 anni di lotta, l'inizio della rivoluzione, perché a Cuba v'è stata una sola rivoluzione, quella che iniziò Carlos Manuel de Céspedes il 10 ottobre 68 e che il nostro popolo porta avanti oggi. So we'll see how this is very in line with what de Céspedes is saying, right? There is a continuity between the work of her grandfather, the political actions of her grandfather, and the politics of Castro and Guevara. So on January 2, 1968, de Céspedes traveled for the first time to post-revolutionary Cuba. She arrived at the invitation of Maria, who was one of the protagonists of the Cuban Revolution, and was also the director of the cultural institution Casa de las Americas, which still exists today. On January 12, she participated as an Italian delegate in the Conference of Havana, in which over 400 intellectuals discussed their role in the fight against imperialism in the Third War. She spoke about her own participation in the organization that fought against in the post-war context, and she compared her own effort and Italy's effort in eliminating illiteracy in the post-war years to the 8-month efforts to eliminate illiteracy on the island. So Cuban revolutionary had pledged that in 8 months there would be not a single illiterate person in the whole of Cuba. So we have seen that in the article that she wrote in 59, she started establishing relations between the Italian and the Cuban context. And now, in 1968, what she's doing is she's inserting herself and her own history into this complex comparative web. So in May 1968, she traveled back to Italy and she witnessed the insurrections. She is enthusiastic about the insurrections from the very beginning, and the result is this short book of poems, Chansons de filles de Mai, in which she lends her own voice to young women who participated in the insurrections. So the poems are kind of like dramatics, right, in which the young women speak and tell of their experience in the insurrection. But behind these women is Alba de Céspedes herself. So in a letter that she writes to her editor at Edition du Seuil on August 13, 1968, she underlines how there are several Cuban among the students in the insurrections. So many of the protagonists of the poems are actually Cuban students, intermediates. And she also underlines that these students are a projection of herself, a transnational intellectual. So she writes, on the evening of May 30th, when our neighborhood was silent, I took my diary, I wrote the date as usual, and I began to diary in the form of a poem. And in the end, I was no longer a 57-year-old writer, but a little Cuban who studied in Paris, as in Autoportrait, as in Ma Sœur Pilar, as in Lettres en mer. I was the little Cuban and the little French. I was makers, and deep down, I am still one of them. So she's also underlining her role as a witness, somebody who's listening to the events and writing about the events. In the back cover of the French edition, she justifies the fact that she's writing in French because it underlines that the subject matter could not be separated from the means in which she was writing. So she again underlines, I did nothing but listen. She's very much a listener. Those days, those nights, those dialogues that I simply wanted to write down in Italian in my diary presented themselves to me imperatively as actors and a single poem. A poem that I could write only in the language and in the words that got those days. So again, there is the impossibility of separating what is going on from the language in which she's writing. So in reality, the main reason for writing in French is changing her image as a writer. So she really wanted to be seen as an engaged cosmopolitan intellectual. And of course, it also gave her the opportunity to show that she was in French, something that she hoped would be heard in Italy. She also kind of experiencing a second youth, so she writes to her publisher, it's great to be a French author presenting their first manuscript. So underpinning this collection of poems are two types of comparison. A vertical comparison that establishes a relation between the Parisian 1968 insurrections and the fight against fascism during World War II, and the horizontal comparison, which establishes a relation between the Parisian 1968 insurrections and the Cuban Revolution of 1959. So the vertical comparison kind of underpins the whole poems, especially evident in the longest of the poems, titled The Great Sea, in which we learn that the air of Paris during the 1968 insurrections smells of resistance and maquis, which is a reference to the French drafted by the Germans who refused to follow orders and hid in the underbrush. Charles de Gaulle is called the big old man and is criticized for having abandoned the ideals of the resistance and ordering the repression of the insurrections. So she writes, I bet if he was 20, he would be with us. He would pull out his old jacket of resistance fighter, he would cross the Pont de la Concorde, and he would come to this side of the river where imagination and audacity flourish. So according to de Céspedes, the fact that de Gaulle has forgotten his role in the resistance movement and is unable to uphold the vertical, so is unable to understand the 68 insurrections, comes from the fact that he is just too old, right? He's too old, he belongs to a different generation, he is unable to understand the 68 insurrections. And so in writing this, she is by contrast emphasizing her own youth, right? The fact that she is, in contrast, backing up the young people in the movement. In the horizontal comparison that establishes a relation between the Cuban Revolution and 1968 becomes evident in the poem titled Here, in which the protagonist is a Cuban student called Borjita Paz, and this was the name of the sister of de Céspedes' grandmother. So what happens is that this Cuban student finds herself involved in the insurrections. She finds herself on the barricades, and then she comes to a confrontation with the police. So a lot of the poem is around the fear experiences. I was scared. I was so scared that I stood stiff against the wall, without moving, without shouting, my eyes locked in the eyes of the policeman. So the poem is set in Paris. Through Borjita's perspective, it leads the reader to Cuba. So there are a lot of references to Cuba from the official newspaper of the Communist Party titled Gramma, to Borjita at one point talks about the state pension that her mother will receive if she doesn't go back to Cuba, and this is a consolation to her. Implicitly, her confrontation with the police recalls the courage of Cubans during the rebellion against them. And at the end of the poems, she compares the handcuffs that she's forced to wear during her arrest to those worn by her enslaved ancestors, freed by Carlos Manuel de Céspedes in 1868, so exactly 100 years earlier, and we see that this becomes very symbolic here. So the poem My Sister Pilars also has Cuban protagonists. It revolves around two Cuban sisters, one of whom is very fair-skinned and the other is very dark-skinned, and describes how the two sisters battle against racism on a daily basis in Paris. So eventually the two sisters become estranged, but then they meet the barricades. So one of the sisters has a French fiancé, and at a certain point in the poem she talks to the mother of her fiancé, and she talks about the 68 insurrections. And the mother immediately goes like a shiver, the bearded man. So de Céspedes again underlines how the two events are really put into connection and how the older generation is unable to understand either the 68 movement or the Cuban Revolution. At the end, the two sisters meet again on the barricades, and there is this scene in which basically they conclude that there can be no racism on the barricades, right? The 68 movements have abolished that. I told her, we are here, we're all cursed, white people too, our blood has the same color, I saw it. Now we have to remember that the Cuban revolutionaries claimed that the revolution had put an end to racism. There was no racism in Cuba. Okay, So it is well known that the Cuban revolutionaries inspired the students involved in the '68 insurrections. And in the poems, Alba de Céspedes shows this very well when she describes the posters of Che Guevara that decorate the students. But the similarities that de Céspedes perceives across these movements go far beyond this and are really profound. So in both, she sees social movements opposed to the established order and prevailing injustices. And in both, she sees catalysts that will lead to political changes across the world. So even though the 1968 insurrections were relatively short-lived and there was an apparent normality, de Céspedes understood that the changes were irreversible and that the world would never be the same. The poems also put a lot of emphasis in the international nature of the 1968 insurrection. So she sees this and describes this in the poems not as a French phenomenon, but an international phenomenon. So something that affects not only Paris, but Rome, Eastern Europe, Mexico. There is a lot of emphasis on the events in Mexico, as well as the United States. So the energy of the 1968 insurrection is compared to a ball of fire that rolls, right? The fire of our barricades is a ball of fire that rolls from country to country, a little from Rome to Paris, from Warsaw to Bonn, from Mexico City to Washington. Okay, so the poems were written for French readers, but from the very outset, de Céspedes was planning to translate them into Italian and into Spanish because she really wanted people to read poems in Italy and in Cuba. So it is as if the horizontal and vertical comparisons that she's building in the poems, as if this comparison drove her desire for translation. Like she really is very committed to this. And with the hot autumn in Italy in 1969, it becomes even more urgent to publish these poems. So because Mondadori is a bit slow in finding, she decides that she will just self-translate the poems herself, despite loathing a self-translation. And she does this, and Le Ragazze di Maggio is published in a French edition in 1970, and then there is a second edition in 1971. So we have seen that the French book jacket kind of describes her as a listener, right, as a witness to the events. But in the Italian book jacket, she's much more active. She becomes a participant in the production of a revolutionary speech. So she writes, I attended the debates, the meeting, I met the young revolutionaries, I interviewed them, I urged them to speak. So the book is almost presented as a series of interviews, which was actually a common device in narratives about 1968 in the Italian context. There are several books published at that time around the ideas of interviews. Now, in reality, Alba de Céspedes was not even in Paris at the culmination of the May insurrection. She actually had to go back to Rome because of family business. So she came back after de Gaulle had already ordered the repression of the movements. A little bit of staging here going on. And the biography in the Italian book jacket also very much emphasizes de Céspedes' role in the resistance movement, right? So it really portrays her as a revolutionary, as an intellectual, and also puts a lot of emphasis on the censorship that she experienced with the fascist regime. Now, this is a little bit exaggerated in the sense that it is true that the fascist regime issued a ban on new editions of Nessuno Torna Indietro. However, Mondadori continued to reissue the novel and simply claimed that these were leftover copies in the basement. So she completely got away with the censorship. So it's a little bit, obviously she wants to image of somebody who could not work during fascism, but is not, and this is still the way that Alba de Céspedes is presented today, but actually she was always able to write. Okay, so the self-translation is very much a rewriting. So de Céspedes is not so interested in accuracy. She changes many details. Sometimes when there are details about a specific French street, or she changes this into her name. For example, she uses the name of Italian streets. Sometimes she uses the opposite device. So for example, what is a car in the French edition becomes una Giulietta in the Italian text. So she goes more specific. The comparison still upholds, and the goal is explicitly described eroe della liberazione, which we cannot find in the French text. And something interesting is that this edition has a glossary. whereas the edition does not have a glossary. And the glossary has key dates and places of 1968 Parisian insurrection, but also references to places and historical events in Cuba. But the very interesting thing for me was the glossary does not refer to the Italian pages. So you have the French on one side and the Italian on the other side. The glossary refers to the French page. So it is as if she really wanted Italian readers to read the French and the Italian and compare them. And thus, she symbolically does something which is actually missing in this book, which is a comparison between the French and the Italian context. So the book comes out after 1916, which is the year in which de Céspedes publishes on the newspapers a letter in which she declares to have become a member of the Communist Party. The climate in these years is one of mass protest, terrorism, neo-fascist, and economic instability. And her poems are certainly politically positioned, however, they are not particularly controversial. First of all, because they are about Paris, they're not really about the Italian politics. And second, because they don't really challenge established narratives of history. You know, also the fact that they're published by Mondadori tells us something, right? It's definitely not the grassroots leftist publisher. More than anything, these poems show that Alba de Céspedes is a politically engaged writer, is a cosmopolitan writer, has been recognized in Paris. The poems have been published in Paris before, which is very important to her to show this to Italian readers. Basically, Italian readers, if you didn't appreciate me enough, you were wrong. Look, Paris is publishing me. So the kind of consecration that Pascal Casanova talks about. So given the close links that de Céspedes perceived between the Cuban Revolution and the Parisian 1968, the target readership was Cuba. So she was very, very invested in the Cuban translation. And she identified the ideal translator to Padilla. So Padilla was a Cuban poet and translator from French, so very suited to the task. He had supported the revolution and was personally he was personally acquainted with Fidel Castro. Now, in the early 1960s, Alberto Padilla had collaborated with Gian Giacomo Feltrinelli and Massimo Riva on a biography of Fidel Castro. Now, you might remember that Castro at a certain point withdrew his consent. This was a very famous case in Italy. And so Padilla started working with Massimo Riva on a project on Cuban literary dissidents. So slowly, this put him in a difficult position, especially because Cuban rhetoric at the time was all about staying in Cuba, right? Like if you were a Cuban, you had to be in Cuba. So any Cuban citizen living abroad, especially in capitalist countries, this wasn't well seen. So the fact that he was very much in contact and supported exiled intellectuals was not well seen by the Cuban government. And also, he outspokenly criticized high-ranking officials. So he's involved in a series of polemics and surveilled by the state. So de Céspedes and Padilla met personally in Cuba during Alba de Céspedes' second trip to Cuba in 1968, right? So in 1968, she goes back to Paris, and then she goes back to Cuba again. So during her second trip to Cuba, she participates in the UNEAC Congress, which is the National Union of Writers and Artists of Cuba. And she's one of the jury members. She's not a jury member for the Poetry Prize. She's in the jury member group for novels. So she's not exactly judging Padilla, but part in the debates. So what happens is that Padilla is seen as one of the main candidates for the Poetry Prize Julián del Casal, and the jury of the UNEAC Congress agrees that it is a great book of poetry, it deserves the prize. There is criticism of the revolution, but it is constructive criticism, and so it's still on the side of the revolution. Now, the theme of the poems was the role of the poet in the revolutionary process. However, there was also an executive committee, and the executive committee was made of government officials. And so whereas the intellectuals who were part of the jury wanted to give the prize to Padilla, the executive committee claimed that this was counter-revolutionary ideology because there was too much emphasis on the individual at the expense of collective demands. So again, there is a very large polemic. In the end, Eberto Padilla is awarded the prize, and his book is published because it was a condition of the award. But it's published with an introduction by the UNEAC committee that warns the reader that they are about to read a series of poems that are counterparties. So, in this context, Alba de Céspedes does not stand up for Padilla. On the contrary, she supports the decision of the Cuban government. However, she recommends Eberto Padilla to Alberto Mondadori as a Cuban poet that absolutely needs to be translated into Italian. And in fact, she sees the polemics as something productive. She says, well, you know, there has been a lot of talking about because of the Julián del Casal Prize, and we should publish poems because there has, you know, he has gotten a lot of attention. So for her, censorship is almost something good in the sense that it draws attention to work. And also, the fact that she stood on the side of the Cuban government does not prevent her from assigning to Padilla of her works. In fact, she believes that he is the perfect poet to translate these works. And in a way, she's right, because only a non-conformist poet could have accepted to translate a series of poems about 68 insurrections, because Cuban student organization did not participate in the 1968 insurrections at all. And the reason is very simple. Cuba was under the US embargo. There are few people who still agreed to trade with Cuba, and one of them was de Gaulle. So Castro could not afford to lose a very important ally and needed to continue trade with France. There is also the fact that 1968 is a very, very difficult year for Cuba. So there is the American embargo, and then in March, Castro starts the Revolutionary Offensive, which is a project that sets out to nationalize in few months all private businesses in Cuba, including family businesses. And this was judged even by many Cubans, and certainly by international leftists, as premature and unnecessary. So there were protests. In this year, Castro is silent about the Prague Spring, and then in August, disappointing massively leftist Western intellectuals, he decisively backs the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. So this is the time in which many international leftist intellectuals take distance from Cuba, because they had seen in the Cuban Revolution an alternative socialism to the Soviet model, but this is the time in which they begin to be disillusioned with Castro. Now, we have seen that in the poems, de Céspedes weaves a lot of connection with what is happening not only in Paris, but all over, right? The 68 insurrections are for her an international movement. She talks a lot about Mexico. Now, the Mexican insurrections are interesting because they begin, the student movement begins on the 26th of July, which is the anniversary of the first armed action of the Cuban Revolution. This is when there is the attack to the Moncada barracks. So this is not a coincidence, and many students were carrying Cuban flags. Castro takes distance and actually discourages those who are carrying Cuban banners. And then on October 2nd, 1968, there is the Tlatelolco massacre, in which police opens fire against the students who are demonstrating, killing over 350 students. Still today, we don't have the exact number of victims. Again, Castro reports only what the official Mexican government is saying. The number is around 35, so 35 as opposed to 350. Okay, so if in 1961 Castro had claimed that any kind of criticism was fine as long as it was within the revolution, so the famous dentro de la revolución todo contra la revolución nada, in 1968 things are changing, and control on intellectual titans and many are placed under government control. So, as Carlos Aguirre writes, by adopting an authoritarian cultural policy, the Cuban government was trying to prevent a Cuban version of 1960. In a letter from October 25th, 1970, Padilla writes to the Céspedes how he has started translating poems. He praises the poems very much. He says that he really loves them and praises the language that she uses. He really praises her idiosyncratic French, right? He calls it a very direct, passionate, immediate, and he underlines that he will do his best to put the poems in a language that resembles the original. So the fact that these are translingual poems is seen as a positive challenge by the poem translator, but not as something that prevents the poem from being translated. And in fact, as an homage, he attaches the translation of the poem Fear, and he says, well, this is an homage to you, you don't need to pay for it, just have how your poems will look in Spanish. I am sure Cubans will love them. So, the fact that he attaches a translation of a poem kind of proves that the poems are indeed translatable. However, a later letter casts a doubt on this. Padilla writes, the Instituto del Libro has not communicated with me. Everything has been silent around the translation project. It is a surprise to me that the officials of the Instituto have not communicated anything to me in relation to the translation of your chansons. So the Instituto del Libro was, and still is, the institution in charge of approving the translation of foreign writers in Cuba. Now, Padilla does not use the word censorship, but it's clear that there is an impasse here. Something is going on. The permission to translate the poems is not granted. So in these lines, we perceive Padilla's increasing agitation, so we perceive the fact that he's worried about something. We perceive the fact that he's talking to our author, to Alba de Céspedes, as if she also was a non-conformist intellectual, right? There is this kind of sense of agreement between them. She was very right, and in 1971, a few months after writing this letter to the Céspedes, Padilla is arrested without charges. Now, leftist intellectuals are out, and many very important people, among whom Jean Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Italo Calvino, write a letter to Fidel Castro and demand the immediate release of Padilla. Castro is enraged, but under international pressure, he agrees. However, Padilla is forced to film himself acknowledging to harbor counter-revolutionary ideology. After this, he goes into exile in the States. There is another letter by the same people who had written the first letter protesting against this, and Castro by saying that they are all neoliberal bourgeois, they can in their own country, and they're banned from coming to Cuba. So as you can probably imagine, Alba de Céspedes was not among the signatories of, but she was doing something else. She was staying up at night to translate into Italian and French the letter by Haydée Santamaria in defense of the actions of the Cuban government. So we know that she sent this letter to important French and Italian newspapers, and none of them published it. So in this context, the poem that Padilla chooses to attach to his letter to the Céspedes takes another meaning, right? I mean, the fact that this is a poem about fear also tells us something about the state of mind of non-conformist intellectuals who are placed under government surveillance. Okay, so we finally got to our conclusion. In an essay on censorship, Judith Butler notes that when we think of censorship, we tend to separate the subject who censors and the subject who is censored. She also notes that we tend to think of a more powerful person or institution censoring somebody who is less powerful. However, the case of the Chansons kind of calls into question these distinctions. because Alba de Céspedes was really an outsider to the revolution. As the granddaughter of the father of the nation, she participates in the rhetoric of the revolution. But she is also a Cuban citizen who deliberately chose a capitalist country. And as such, she is both an insider and an outsider. Not to mention that she lived many years in the United States, and this was also not very well seen, of course, by the Cuban government. So she has this very liminal position. Also, when we think of a more powerful subject and a less powerful subject, in the case of de Céspedes and Padilla, this is difficult to say, who is it that has power? Because we are dealing with a very well-established cosmopolitan Western intellectual who is forcefully and assertively trying to insert herself into the literary system of a third world country. So related to questions of censorship are questions of translatability, which in turn are related to questions of comparability. So the comparison that underpinned de Céspedes' work was not in line with the politics of neoliberal society, but not particularly transgressive from the European perspective, because the two events related, so the 1968 insurrection and the 1959 Cuban Revolution, were seen as closely related. Also, it wasn't a comparison that challenged an established narrative of a history. However, in the Cuban context, only vertical comparisons grounded in the Cuban context that built on Cuban rhetoric were considered valid. A comparison with the French context called into question the specificity and uniqueness of the revolution, right? And it was perhaps not a problem of ideology, in the sense that ideologically these two movements could certainly be related, but it was a problem of practical current politics, right? Could not want a Cuban 1968. So, in other words, what we can say is that the comparisons of de Céspedes were unidirectional. They were valid from the European point of view, but not really from the Cuban point of view. So this overall teaches that, the answer to the famous question, what is a controversial comparison, depends really on the point of view from which the comparison is judged. And it also teaches us that it is always closely linked to social political factors. So I would like to conclude with a citation by an anthropologist, Aram Yangoan. All forms of comparison are problems of translation, and all problems of translation are ultimately problems of comparison. So thank you very much.
Let's go crazy.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk. I just have two very simple and stupid questions. One is about the resistance of the Istituto del Libro, in Cuba about this translation. I was wondering if we have telling us if it was more a resistance towards the translators, so Padilla and all these activities, or about the specific book it was planning to translate. And the second one is, because as you showed, de Céspedes' position about Cuba and the way she's dealing with the different relations is extremely ambiguous. She's really on the edge. I was just wondering up to which point we can read as, someone who wasn't reading the room well, like someone who being from the outside and having a general appraisal of the situation was able to somehow share and understand, and of course share also because it was useful for her, the vertical comparison, but wasn't in the best position to know why the horizontal one wasn't working.
Yeah, so thank you. These are two excellent. So In the case of why did the Instituto del Libro not give authorization to translate the poems? We don't know, because Alba de Céspedes went to a great deal of effort to eliminate any documents about this. But what we know is that Padilla was allowed to translate other things. So he was a very active translator. He was translating European authors all the time. So it was not a matter that he was no longer allowed to translate, which led that it was the topic of the poems that made them controversial, and the comparisons that Alba de Céspedes was weaving in them. Your second question, the question about to what extent was Alba de Céspedes familiar with the Cubans, like does this impasse happen because she doesn't really understand the Cuban context? This pretty much.
Yeah, perhaps my understanding is wrong, but my impression is that the Cuban change in these few years was impressive.
Oh, yes.
From themselves as part of a global revolution and somehow some local phenomenon to the nationalistic
exactly.
and internal, also because of all the problems that I raised.
Absolutely.
So, like, up to which point she knew this context?
So, obviously she was an European author. She was very much Italian. Like, she was very much Italian. She grew up in Italy with, you know, sometimes in France, but she's an Italian author. She wrote in Italian her whole life. Her relationship to Cuba was really very limited up to the point in which she is invited to Cuba in the post-revolutionary context. And we have to think that, you know, at the moment feeling not appreciated in Italy, she goes to Cuba and everybody welcomes her as the granddaughter of the father of the nation. She is hosted at the Hotel Habana Libre, which by a curious coincidence was built where her parents used to have their residence, right? So she is given, they make her feel very important, and she's loving this, right? Plus it's very helpful to her image as an engaged intellectual. I mean, I think she really believed in this too, right? So I'm a bit cynical about her position. She's a very contradictory character. I mean, she's the daughter of diplomats, right? So, you know, she behaves like a diplomat. Depending on whom she's talking to. And there are a lot of contradictions. Like you find letters that say one, a letter written the second day that says exactly the opposite. So she lies a lot, right? This probably will do. But I think she does follow what happens in Cuba very closely. And I think she sincerely was backing Fidel Castro. Like, I mean, she's almost like from certain letters that she writes, I mean, the way she talks about Fidel Castro, like she has this, I didn't talk about this much, it would have become too complicated, but at the same time, in 1968, she starts thinking about a Cuban novel that she always wanted to write. And this novel is called Con Grande Amore. And the title refers to Fidel Castro, right? Fidel Castro says, oh, she talks about how she met Castro, and she asks him, oh, how did you manage to do all of this in such a short time? And Castro answers with Grande Amore. Con Grande Amore. So this is, she really believed in Castro, and she talks about how the two of them met. And she describes this as un incontro tra due timidi, so a meeting with two shy persons. And in this, the way that she tells this story, it is as if she herself and Castro were on the same level, right? Like she talks about how Castro comes with her and wants to say later, so he wants to address her in the formal person, and she goes like, no, 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 like absolutely not, you know, we need to use the informal between us, and Castro goes like, no, no, you first, right? Like basically like you're the most important person in Cuba. So we have she really was almost in love with Fidel Castro. Up to the very years of her life, she's writing to him and backing him up always. She becomes an absolute follower of Castro, and she never contradicts him. But I think in the beginning, she believed in this international utopia in which the arts would merge with the political avant-garde and be one with them, and there would be freedom of expression. I think in the beginning, she's really believing in this, as many other leftist intellectuals did, and she's embracing it. And I think the poems show this. But as I said, she's also very opportunistic. And actually, the Chansons de Fille de Mai, you know, she's trying to position this poem with grassroots publishers, but she's also like really pushing for Simon & Schuster. She writes to very established publishers, and you know, she wants these poems to be published in the States as well. So, you know, she's a very contradictory character. But I think she sincerely believed as an international movement, and she sincerely backed the younger generation. So there is a lot of sincerity in this, and she was an engaged political intellectual. You know, she didn't like the fact that the world didn't see her as such. Her novels are not politically engaged at all. These are the first politically engaged things that she writes. But she will continue to write politically engaged things until the end of her life. From this moment on, it's something that happens in her late 50s. Maybe there's still space for a change for us too, but she changes completely. She goes from writing romantic novel to writing about Cuba and the 68 insurrections.
I have a very simple question of method. Among the many fascinating things that you said, there's one that you kept repeating, and that is that she went out of her way to eliminate certain documents.
Yeah.
Now, you know factually that the documents are not there. But what did she do to go out of her way to eliminate them? Or is that not factual, but an interpretation?
No, that's my interpretation. That's in fact mine, because I was very puzzled by the way that I could find absolutely no reference to her half-brother. She has letters by everybody, by this super distant cousin, by this. She never mentioned him in any document, but she must have had a relationship to him because he was administering her family properties. So this was very strange to me. And then there is this letter by Padilla, and there is nothing else about why the Chansons are not published in Cuba. But all her previous correspondence is about wanting to publish these poems in Cuba. So there are so many references to how she's going to publish these poems in Cuba, when she's going to publish them. And the same happens with her novel, with her Cuban novel, Con Grande Amore, which chapter of my book. So in this novel, which is really a novel about how the history of the revolution intertwines with the history of her own family, and it's also a novel about herself. So in this novel, Cuban authorities had begun to translate it. And then we have a letter by, and this is actually in the archive, a letter by her Italian translator asking, well, you know, what happened? I haven't heard from you. You know, the documents that were sent to the agencies and that needed to be checked by this government official and so never came back to me. You know, like I would love to have other chapters to translate what is going on. And we know that the two of them were very close. So I think it's exactly what happens. That because she's so faithful to Fidel Castro, she doesn't want readers of her archive to know that she was censored in Cuba. Because she wants to be seen as somebody who is part of the Cuban Revolution. I mean, she writes openly in the novel that she writes, you know, before I had all these properties in Cuba and I was considered a wealthy person, but only now that all my properties have been confiscated, I feel home, you know, because Cuba now is my home. So she really, I think she sincerely believes in Castro, and she never stops believing. We also know that, you know, like, I mean, there's all sorts of things. People from Cuba write her, and you find the shape of feet, you know, in the letter because they all want shoes from her, they all want medicine. But she, even with her closest friends, like, she continues to write until the end of her life, and they're in good terms. She writes to Lezema Lima, she writes to Carpentier, to Alejo Carpentier. So she is very much in contact with all these Cuban intellectuals, and also intellectuals not very well seen by the regime, such as Lezema Lima was homosexual and was actually a very hard time with Castro. She's very close to him, but at the same time never says something against the decision made by the Cuban government.
Any other questions? The time, I think we can stop here. We have if the hearing has worked with the weather we've had the last couple of days, you never know what's open and what's active. But in any case, if the hearing is here, we have a small reception upstairs where we can continue the conversation. But in the meantime, please join me again. Thank Elisa for her for sharing her research with us, for her lecture, and till the next time.
Thank you.